Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to this week's episode of the Digital Law News produced by Anson Evaluate. I'm Amelia Davies, an apprentice solicitor at Digital Law, and I'm joined by my colleague Peter Wright, and we're going to run through some news stories that will be coming up this week. I'll pass over to Peter to introduce himself, and then we will get started.
Thanks, Amelia. So my name is Peter. I'm a solicitor and the founder and managing director at Digital Law, and we've got some, stories this week that I think apply to services, products that probably the vast majority of people use almost day to day, which I think makes them quite relevant. So I will pass back to you so that we can kick off.
Thanks, Peter. So our first story today is looking at Meta and WhatsApp. And I think we've said this time and time again. Meta and WhatsApp are the gift that just keeps on giving. I don't think there's a podcast this year where we've not mentioned at least Meta or WhatsApp or both. So diving straight in, WhatsApp have announced some new privacy features. So users will be able to leave group chats silently, control who sees their online status, and block screenshots on view once messages. So this is quite interesting because if you listened to our podcast last week, we were talking about how WhatsApp were not going to change their privacy settings in relation to encryption. However, they've now come back and said, well, we're going to be doing this to help protect your privacy. So are they sort of trying to backpedal here in relation to boosting users' kind of thought about WhatsApp and whether they still want to be using this? Potentially. So I'll pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia, and I think we just have to reiterate a few things here. First of all, sort of thing, for those at the back, just to make sure, shouldn't be using WhatsApp for business-related activity, I think is the first point to make, or using any of Meta's products for business-related activity for that matter. I know that Meta is promoting the Meta portal. Use this for your business calls and video conferences. And well, the answer is if you are in a business that involves discussing lots of personal data, so customers, clients, colleagues, staff, let's face it, most businesses do that. If you're doing any of that, you don't want to be doing it on a product from Meta because it doesn't comply with some of the fairly basic requirements when it comes to data protection, privacy, and security from a legal and regulatory standpoint. In particular, if you're in a highly regulated sector, so medicine, pharmaceuticals, accounting, law, banking, insurance, anything where you've got a big regulator with a big stick ready to fine you for a problem. If you're using a platform like this, it then could be seen as indicative of generally poor standards and awareness of regulatory compliance anyway. So it kind of puts you on a bit of a slippery slope to potential regulatory enforcement. So that's the first bit to be mindful of. I think the second thing to think about is that these changes to WhatsApp are part of incremental changes to the platform that have been ongoing now for the last 18 months or so. Interestingly, all of the original founders and those who actually set up WhatsApp in the first place have now all left. They did stay on with the platform for a while once it was taken over by Facebook, but then because of the direction of travel in terms of issues around privacy and security, they all ended up leaving the platform and saying we are no longer associated with this, and in some instances they said we're not particularly happy with what's now happening, but we no longer control this, there's nothing we can really do about it. So all of these changes are wrapped up as being, this means that you've got greater control over your online presence, privacy, security, but have you really? There's the whole thing over, yes, you can now leave groups silently, but if you can leave silently, does that mean you could arrive silently as well? So you could have people on chats that you might not realize are on there who are seeing them. Again, that's an implication from a business perspective. What if you've added someone inadvertently to a group that shouldn't be there, and then colleagues can't necessarily see that that's the case, or that they have then left the group when you thought that they were there, actually seeing and being aware of discussions that they needed to see. This is another reason why it's simply not, even not just from a privacy security perspective, just from a usability point of view, this is why these tools are not suitable, because you can't rely on them in the same way. They are not doing this to say, oh yes, this makes it great from, so you can work with colleagues and work across teams and things. No, that is not why this is being done. Different motivations, different reasoning behind them. screenshots blocking for view once messages, so you can't screenshot something on there if it's just to be seen once. Again, not great if you were wanting to use that for business purposes. And overall, these are a raft of changes that indicate that significant changes are taking place in terms of how WhatsApp is organized, run, and administered. So, the warning continues to be there. Do not use this platform for business-related activity. And ultimately, there are better, secure, free platforms out there. And if you're operating a business, there are better, secure messaging systems you could be using for that purpose as well, to demonstrate compliance and also keep not just your personal data secure, but things like commercial, confidential, privileged information, commercially sensitive stuff that you might want to make sure that it's kept within a circle of trust. WhatsApp is not the platform that allows you to do that, basically.
Thanks, Peter. So our next story today is looking at the NHS. So a software outage affecting the NHS 111 service has been caused by a cyber attack. So this attack happened on Thursday, the 4th of August, and the attack targeted systems used for referring patients for care, including ambulance being dispatched and out-of-hours appointments booking and emergency prescriptions. Allegedly, the NHS said the disruption had been minimal. However, moving forward to some later stories, Advance, which provides additional services for patient check-ins in 111, said it's actually going to take maybe 3 or 4 weeks to fully recover because this has become a ransomware attack. And therefore, hackers have taken control of the IT system and have stolen the data, demanding payment for the victims to recover. So I will pass over to Peter to discuss kind of both steps of this story.
Thanks, Amelia. I mean, this is an interesting one, both in terms of the cybersecurity implications and the wider implications for the NHS, which we'll come to. Let's first of all just look at this from a technical story point of view. So the NHS has been on the receiving end of cyber attacks in the past. Let's remember that it was hit by the WannaCry ransomware attack in 2017. The NHS was vulnerable to that on that occasion because that ransomware infected loads of organisations all around the world. The NHS was vulnerable because it was using old, unsupported versions of Windows that were no longer being supported by Microsoft. Basically, they'd sort of had the licenses extended and extended over and over again. And then the agreement had lapsed, so they were then basically using packages, desktops, etc., that were not being supported. What does that mean? It means they're not getting those regular security updates that say, please switch off your machine so you can install the update. That wasn't happening, which meant that those systems were vulnerable, which meant the ransomware got in there and caused not insignificant amounts of damage. We're told that lessons have been learned, the system has been improved. So the basic message from the NHS is, disruption was minimal. There's been no lasting impact in terms of out-of-hours appointment booking, emergency prescriptions, etc. They're basically saying nothing to see here. But what I think is important is to sort of read between the lines. So if we're talking about a ransomware attack on systems that allow booking appointments and the getting of prescriptions, that suggests that personal data may well have been breached. It may well have been to the point that if those systems are locked, that means then that, for example, the hacker has control of them. And if a ransom isn't paid, they could then potentially breach that data on the dark web, somewhere else, sell it, do various nefarious things with it. It also suggests a degree of command and control of a system that a hacker may have gained. So I can imagine that, Advanced, which is the firm providing digital services to the NHS, has said, this is notable, the company refused to say whether it was in negotiations with hackers or paying a ransom to them. I mean, for the avoidance of doubt, you shouldn't be feeding the hackers. Don't pay a ransom. You should have systems that allow you to basically do a full hard reset back up to the last time a full backup was taken, and get the whole thing back up and running as quickly as possible. That's what modern systems should have in terms of resilience. You should be looking and thinking, oh, well, this is going to be really difficult. We should pay the ransom. Because guess what? There's no guarantee you'll get everything back. And then once they've hit you for one ransom, they could then come back in the future and hit you again because they've managed to do it. And they have no confidence that you'll be able to make your systems more secure. And very often, systems are not then made more secure because they didn't know what made them vulnerable in the first place. So that's the second key thing to take away, and the fact that if that personal data has been compromised, we could be looking at a significant data protection breach that could be reported to the ICO, there could be regulatory enforcement, and fines that would follow. Number 8, when we about our NHS digital being in terms of, for example, is coming, so limited NHS budget, difficulties of paying for energy costs be far worse actually than, for example, for individual users. We're looking at home heating bills of going up by £5,000, while for businesses they're going up on a far bigger proportion than just that £5,000. So I'm speaking to people in the industry who are looking at potential increases in energy bills. Why is that important? If you are losing 10, 15, 20 million pounds in the form of lost revenue in terms of paying out the ransoms, then that means you've got less money to deliver the urgent care. Final point, the NHS has been running hot, as it were, dealing with COVID for the last 2 years. Now, in August 2022, it is so overloaded that they're saying it's basically in a position like you'd normally have in a winter crisis in, say, January, February, with dealing with people who've got flu and chest infections and bugs. It is at those levels in terms of dealing and providing urgent care in August, which is traditionally when things are a little bit quieter and everyone can catch a breath and then keep on. And that's just due to everything from COVID, still having to deal with people with COVID, to dealing with then the same logistics problems with people who can't work due to the impact of that. Of COVID all the way through, and this just becomes a real ongoing problem as a result. And therefore, the point is, NHS is vulnerable. If you were a foreign actor, of Russia, China, or some other actor, and you wanted to put the NHS into a state of crisis, hit it with a major ransomware attack. This could have been an attempt to see how well protected the system is, and the answer clearly is not very. So I think we need to be mindful of that it wouldn't take much, I think, in the coming months for the system to be badly compromised by an attack like that.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. I sort of read this and I was fairly incredulous when I read the title of this. So, the UK Parliament has closed down its TikTok account after MPs raised concerns about the risk of data being passed to the Chinese government. So the account has been locked and content deleted only days after the launch. And so this is as a result of a letter that had been sent by peers and MPs. And the letter said that the data security risks associated with the app were considerable. And TikTok executives were unable to reassure MPs that the company would prevent data transfer to ByteDance, which is the owner of TikTok, and should the parent company make any requests for the data. I mean, if you're a regular listener, you will no doubt hear some red flags there. So I'll pass over to Peter to go through this.
Thanks, Amelia. I think your incredulity is well placed. In theory, we're aware now of some of the problems with platforms like TikTok, whereby they are, it's a Chinese company, ByteDance, and we know that the powers of the Chinese state mean that they can take a look at the data that companies like ByteDance are collecting and storing on Chinese servers and infrastructure, are then basically potentially open to surveillance by the Chinese state. So the fact that this well-known fact appears to have been missed by the UK parliamentary authorities, so this is Parliament, not the government, This is parliamentary authorities setting up a TikTok account and then thinking, oh, perhaps this actually isn't a very good idea. Particularly, you'd have thought that the fact that UK MPs, members of parliament, have been sanctioned by the Chinese government for having said things that weren't exactly warm, fuzzy and friendly about China, might have made the authorities governing the House of Commons and Parliament think about this. But they didn't. So they then started thinking, oh, well, this is how we engage with young people. Let's have an account on TikTok, and not thinking about the fact that, think about the GPS data being tracked. So you can then see GPS data of all those who are recording and uploading the videos. And there would be network information in there about the parliamentary IT system, all being logged, all being collected and squirreled away to servers in China that could be looked at by the Chinese government. So the point here is that it's quite scary, to put it bluntly, to think that the UK Parliament weren't aware of these issues until they were brought to their attention by the look of it, the peers and MPs themselves. Why they weren't, for example, considering the advice and guidance from the UK National Cyber Security Centre, and indeed the guidance that the security services, so the NCSC, MI5 and the British military hand out to their own staff that says, do not go anywhere near platforms like this. Why is that sort of stuff not disseminated across the rest of the public sector to authorities like the administrators of Parliament as a whole? This is the worrying thing. Ultimately, a bit of a cursory lesson there to think about the risks before jumping headfirst into opening accounts on platforms like this.
Thanks, Peter. So speaking about accounts and platforms, moving on to our next story. So this is looking at Booking.com, a very well-known holiday and kind of destination booking platform. So a woman in North London says she feels victimized after dozens of tourists turned up at her home when her private address was placed on the Booking.com accommodation website. So travelers from Hong Kong, Saudi Arabia and Los Angeles turned up at the home, and this was during July. However, she was not aware that obviously her property was on the website and it was in fact a scam. So to confirm, Booking.com have now removed the property from the website. However, it's quite scary to think that this particular person's personal home was on Booking.com. People had turned up, and to add insult to injury, the listing for her address and the pictures, they didn't actually meet up at all. So for a start, the pictures on Booking.com didn't even look like her house. So I mean, there is a few things going wrong here. So I will pass over to Peter to continue with this.
Thanks, Amelia. Yes, I think that you've highlighted there the obvious red flag. If you were to check on Street View the address that you've received there, you'd see that it didn't tally up with the pictures that were on the website. But nonetheless, that's not going to be the sort of check that you as a customer could always carry out to make sure that a property listing on a site like this is genuine. Staying in sort of short-term holiday lets like this is now incredibly popular, rather than staying in hotels. And so the popularity of platforms like Booking.com has exponentially grown. And people put faith in that. They think, oh, well, there's thousands of properties listed on here. Booking.com must be really good. They've got loads of good reviews. And then you might not realize that the booking process in this instance was fraudulent. So what was probably happening is that you'd see this listing, you go, oh, that looks very nice. You'd then register your interest. You get a message back from the person purporting to let the property. And in that instance, you as a customer were probably speaking to a scammer who's then saying, oh, well, yes, the property is here and it's so much a night, and it's available on those times. Answer any questions that you as a potential tourist, as a potential customer would have. And then, of course, you'd end up making the payment, and it would, even though you're making the payment to Booking.com, it would then end up going through to the scammer. So the problem here is that platforms like Booking.com have increasingly put security measures in to, in theory, make sure that the people on their account who are opening these accounts and saying, yes, I have a property to let, making sure that they are speaking to the genuine person who has the authority to let that property. You have to have the various correct checks and balances in place to make sure you have got the right person there. But in this instance, obviously, that had been circumvented. And as you can't even sort of check on, I'd say checking on Google Street View once you know the address, because usually the actual address isn't confirmed on the listing. You actually have to get in touch with whoever's listing it. They will then tell you the exact address, so you know where to turn up to when you're, getting your cab or whatever, and you turn up with your luggage expecting to stay there. And in this instance, if you'd done the Street View, you would have worked out that, hang on, the place I'm going to bears no relation to the nice photos on the listing. But that doesn't necessarily always work. I mean, you could be thinking, oh, I'm going to be staying in this 6th floor apartment, so therefore the view on Street View might not necessarily bear a relation to what actually the property looks like once you go into the development. So yes, you can do that little bit of due diligence before you end up paying anything on a site like this. You'd want to have hopefully checked and made sure that everything is as far and above board as possible. But I think this just highlights the fact that you have to be very wary before making your bookings, and also check what happens, what are the terms that someone like Booking.com or any other platform are providing. So if it turns out you arrive at what you think is the place you're going to stay at on holiday, and you then find it isn't actually the correct property and there has been a scam, what happens? Do you get your money back? Do they provide you with another property, or are you left high and dry? I'd check those requirements quite carefully before handing over my hard-earned currency to make the booking. So it's always a matter of sort of checking these things as far as you can. But I do feel for this poor person who, indeed, you would feel victimised if you endlessly had tourists turning up expecting to stay at your property and you knew nothing about it. Let's hope this is an isolated incident, but I think we all have to be on our guard when using these apps and platforms.
Thanks, Peter. So moving on to our next story. So this story comes from the ICO. A former health advisor has been found guilty of accessing medical records of patients without a valid legal reason. So Christopher O'Brien, working for the South Warwickshire NHS Foundation, when he unlawfully accessed the records of 14 patients who were known personally to him between June and December 2019. He did so without a valid business reason and without the knowledge of the trust, so that without the knowledge of essentially the NHS. So I will pass over to Peter to go through the really big issues that we've got with this.
Indeed, a very interesting salutary story here that reminds us of the importance of making sure that when you are working in an organisation where there are lots of patient records or very sensitive personal data, you are only supposed to look at that information when you have a valid business reason. So in this instance, you'd be looking at that personal data, patient medical records, if you are going to be meeting that patient and you need to then work out what treatment they need. Or if you are dealing with arranging a prescription for them, something like that, having a valid business reason. Just looking up that information on a database because you feel like it is not permitted. And the thing here is that this individual has done this with 14 different patients where there's no clear reason why he was accessing that data. And we aren't told, in terms of the summary here, we don't know for sure what the reason or the excuse was for what he did. But I think that this is, it's an important cursory thing to remember, because if you are in an organisation like, say, a bank where there's people's financial data, or a pharmacy where you'd have details of all the prescriptions that someone's got, you are only supposed to access that personal data with a valid business reason. So in the same way, if you work for, say, a major high street bank and you start looking at people's bank accounts and their mortgages and their investments that they have with that bank, and there isn't a valid business reason, you're following up from a call or a query or whatever, if you don't have that valid business reason, you shouldn't be doing it. And in the same way, you're breaking the law in the same way this individual was. So it's an important point that these institutions need to be very thorough on their training. So when a new starter like this individual comes in, they're told, You only look at this information when you have a valid business reason. If you don't, not only is it bad on and reflect badly on us, you personally will be fined, and you will then potentially have, in this instance, I mean, this person was fined at the magistrate's court. So guess what? Criminal conviction, which you have to disclose, and will show up on a disclosure and borrowing service check for any future jobs that you may apply for. So really a risk that should not be taken lightly. And in this instance, it's going to have, an implication for this person. They've now got to pay a £3,000 fine and then walk around with a criminal record that says, I broke the Data Protection Act with my previous employer. I think one final point here is that this relates to offences that occurred in 2019. And we've just been through the COVID pandemic, where we know that lots of personal data was being collected. So even the average hospitality venue, bars, restaurants, etc., were having to get details of people, their home addresses, who they were with, so they could then do contact tracing. So lots of personal data was being hoovered up and collected and kept by lots of organisations to comply with the extraordinary circumstances of the pandemic. But we also then had, for example, doctors' surgeries were performing triages. When someone calls in and says, I'd like to speak to a doctor, rather than saying, yes, your appointment's at 3 o'clock in 2 weeks' time. But that's what tends to be. Well, it used to be with my doctor, probably waiting a month now. But the point is that there's been an awful lot of reviewing of patient records so that triage process can be carried out. And then, does someone need to speak to the doctor? Can they speak to the duty nurse? Should they be put through to NHS 111? That level of triage to handle the urgent care and prioritisation of care has been a factor of life in a lot of NHS trusts and surgeries. So it could be the case that we see more fines like this. Will the ICO and the regulators take a view that, well, during the pandemic, people might not have known or understood exactly what the laws were, and so we'll stand back and we won't enforce on egregious instances? Or will they turn around and say, well, you still should have had the right training in place, and people should only have been looking at this if they have that valid business reason, and failing that, we will enforce and fine? That's what we'll now wait to find out in the next couple of years. Surely there will be lots of instances like this that could potentially be ripe for enforcement by the Information Commissioner.
Thanks, Peter. So that was our last news story for today. A big thank you to Anson Evaluate for helping to produce this webinar, and we'll be back next week. Just a reminder that these episodes are available on our website, our YouTube channel and podcast channels such as Spotify and both Amazon and Apple Music. Thank you for listening, and we hope to see you again next week.